Last spring, 14 million people tuned in to watch the series finale of HBO's hit series, Game of Thrones. The series is set in the fictional kingdom of Westeros, and the show tracks several story arcs over its 8 seasons. The main plot revolves around the realm's aristocratic families, who are all warring for control of the Iron Throne. The story has captivated millions of fans with its depth and creativity, but fans may be surprised to learn that it is broadly based on historical events. Written for television by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, many elements from George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones takes inspiration from late medieval English history, specifically the events and people of the Wars of the Roses. The central conflict of Game of Thrones is the rivalry between the two houses in the realm, the Starks and the Lannisters. In the 15th century, the conflict in England known as the Wars of the Roses was also between the two main royal houses, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Name similarity, see? In the article titled The Wars of the Roses, published by Yale University Press, the reasons that caused the Wars of the Roses are explored, and the general consensus is that it was started by Henry VI because he was such a weak king. He was sickly and fell into a coma multiple times during his reign, causing the need for a regent. This is reminiscent of in Game of Thrones, when Aerys Targaryen rules ineffectively and throws his kingdom into chaos. Both kings are christened the Mad King by their subjects at this time. In England, the country was completely divided over the subject of the regency. The two main contenders were the Earl of Lancaster and the Duke of York. Both men were very powerful and had a lot of land and wealth in the country, and both had legitimate claims to the throne themselves. York was eventually beheaded alongside his son Edmund by the Lancasters, which prompted his eldest surviving son Edward to stake his own claim to the throne. Because Edward was young and strong and Henry VI was sick, old, and weak, Edward was able to take the throne fairly easily, thus making him Edward IV. Edward IV faced many rebellions because Henry was still alive during this time, and having a rival king alive is always a danger. In Game of Thrones, the last of the Targaryens, who are the previous royal dynasty, are in exile in Essos after being usurped by the new king, Robert Baratheon. In Season 1, he says that as long as a Targaryen lives, his throne will not be safe. The younger of the Targaryens, Daenerys, echoes the story of another character in the Wars of the Roses. During the reign of Henry VI, the king's half-brother has a baby boy called Henry Tudor. When Edward IV came to the throne, like many Lancasters, Henry Tudor had to flee. He spent most of his life in exile, and he was there for about 15 to 20 years, by which time he was the last surviving Lancastrian heir, and thus, to many people, the rightful heir to the throne. He raised an army and sailed to England, gathering support along the way to wage war against the hated York king, now Richard III. In Game of Thrones, this historical narrative is recalled when, after about 15 years in exile, Daenerys sails to Westeros at the head of an army to wage war against the hated Queen Cersei, one of the Lannisters. When she arrives, she kneels to the ground on the beach. According to the medieval chronicler Robert Fabian, Henry Tudor did the exact same thing when he arrived in his homeland after spending most of his life in exile. Here, both Daenerys and Henry return to their homelands as serious contenders to the throne, fighting against a tyrannical monarch. Both eventually win their thrones, but struggle to unite their kingdoms. To do this, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the old York king Edward IV. This made that their children, both York and Lancaster, ending the conflict. In Game of Thrones, it doesn't go quite this far, but in order to ally herself with the North, Daenerys has a brief affair with Jon Snow, the leader of the North, and they create an alliance. There are many powerful and ambitious women in Game of Thrones, just like Daenerys. In real history, this was true as well, but societal expectations meant that they mostly worked behind the scenes to achieve their political ambitions. The most striking parallel is between Cersei Lannister and Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou was the wife of the weak king, Henry VI. She was extremely ambitious and ruthless. everything her husband wasn't. It was actually her that gave the order to behead York, starting the Wars of the Roses in the first place. When Edward IV came to the throne, he disinherited her son. This was much of a shock to Margaret, and so she caused many revolts and rebellions to try and take the throne back for Lancaster during the entirety of Edward IV's reign. But she was trying to take back the throne not for her husband, who was still living, but for her son. Accounts remain that claimed that her son was a cruel boy who would abuse servants, rape peasants, and made gruesome threats to anyone who didn't do exactly what he wanted. Margaret of Anjou's response to this was explained in an article titled Reflections of Power, Margaret of Anjou and the Dark Side of Queenship. She dismissed and ignored all allegations, instead doting on her son. He could do nothing wrong. Much like Cersei in Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, Cersei blatantly ignores and sometimes even supports her son's cruelty. He has sadistic and psychopathic tendencies and has no reservations in brutally torturing his subjects. Both Cersei and Margaret here go to extreme lengths to protect and defend their children and their legacies, regardless of the cost on others, all for the name of love. Over the past 8 years, Game of Thrones has become notorious for its graphic portrayal of extreme violence, but in reality it just barely imitates the events that inspired it. Because we don't experience much violence or gore in our daily lives, viewers today are far more shocked than those who would experience the events in real history would have been. Life in medieval England during the Wars of the Roses was hard. Violence, disease, famine, poverty, and death permeated all aspects of everyday life. Because life now is so comparatively safe, the dangers of life in the past have become something of a source of entertainment, as explored in Volume 27 of Studies in Medievalism. The incredible popularity of Game of Thrones proves how popular stories based on history can be. Other elements of Game of Thrones are inspired by actual history. The Red Wedding, the Wall, the War of the Five Kings, but nothing has a greater impact on the story and its characters than the conflict that was the Wars of the Roses. So next time you watch a movie or a show, I ask you, take a minute to look up its inspiration, and I'll bet anything you'll get a quick history lesson. Thank you.